Thank you and welcome to the show today. The topic this morning is the impact of imperialism and colonialism on the African continent. And to talk about the impact of colonialism and imperialism on Africa, we have with us Alana McLaughlin. Now, Alana, let's start off today by having you to give us some information in reference to your background, your education, and some of the things that were important in terms of eventually bringing you to us. But I also must remind the audience, in case you forget, that this is the beginning of the 9th year that we've had with you, and we certainly appreciate you. And what we would like for you to do is to give us some background, education, and some of your experiences so that our audience might know more about you and some of the things that have happened to you since you first started with us more than 9 years ago. Let's do it from that perspective.
Well, Dr. Haney, I am in the 11th grade. I go to the Nashville School of Arts, where my specialty is music. I play trumpet and French horn and piano. I do jazz band, classical, and marching band with the Pearl Cone Marching Band in North Nashville. Growing up, I loved music, and I still do, but I also had a pull towards politics. I've always enjoyed learning why our government is set up the way that it is and why laws are established and the process that we go through to get said laws established. And I've always wanted to have a say-so in things, and so my dream is to be a political commentator. I do plan on going to college for it. I'm undecided as of right now, but that is my lifelong dream, and I believe that I will have a show of my own one day. That's basically sums up my background and why I'm on the show, and I feel like the show gives me kind of a head start on giving my opinion and spreading my knowledge to others, because ultimately that's all I want to do. And I feel like I can appeal to my age group a lot better, seeing as they'll probably respond better to someone who looks like them and is of their same, age range, as opposed to listening to Fox News or CNN.
Very good. And so, Alana, let's talk about, I think we said that the topic today is the impact of imperialism and colonialism on the African continent. And during the last part of this segment, let's have you to give us some information in reference to the definition of imperialism, colonialism in the African continent, and why this should be important in terms of what we're talking about today.
Well, imperialism and colonialism are often confused. Most people think that they're interchangeable, though they are not. Colonialism is a result of imperialism, and imperialism is when a larger, more powerful country takes control of a smaller country. For instance, imperialism could be described as Europe's influence on North America, or Europe's influence on Africa, which we'll be getting into in the next segment. Colonialism, when most people hear it, they think of Jamestown. They think of the early settlers here in the United States, but most people fail to realize that colonialism was a widespread thing, though it came in waves. There was the imperialism around the time of the early United States, and then new imperialism at the end of the 19th century, which is what we'll be focusing on today.
And this is when Africa is divided during this period of new imperialism, I think
yes.
as it was called.
This is when British, German, all these forces came in and changed the face of Africa forever.
Very good. And so what we'll do, we'll take our first commercial break in the next minute or so. But what I want you to do during this second segment is to enlarge upon this whole idea of imperialism and colonialism, and speak specifically to the African continent, because I think that you've got a lot of information in reference to the relationship between these three ideas. And what I'd like for you to do is to demonstrate to me, because I was somewhat reluctant to talk about this as a topic with you this morning, but I think you've demonstrated that you've got some good information in reference to it, and that you're ready to prepare to deliver it. So when we take our first commercial break, we'll come back and we'll give you an opportunity to go full force into telling the audience of the impact of imperialism and colonialism on the African continent. And of course, we'll be back with our audience following this very, very short commercial break. Back to the second segment of the show for today, and then we'll talk about the impact of imperialism and colonialism on the African continent. And then we can get into it. We'll have 8 minutes to do.
This is going to be 8, right?
Yeah,
and then
8
10.
minutes, then 10 minutes to do the second.
Got it. I think that I'm going to make this segment like leading up to imperialism, and then the 10 minutes like during and after.
Okay, yeah,
Okay.
Well, like, however you want to do it.
Okay.
As long as you can keep on doing it and keep on speaking and making noise over there, you don't have any problem. The only problem with the television is when it goes silent. Nobody says anything. See, because that's
You
when
don't have that problem
that's
with
when
me.
people stop and look, and start around.
For they'll be listening in bed, and they leave and sit up. And
It's gone silent. So
Oh, man.
television don't go silent. No talk show. But I think this is a good show. It's demonstrating you got some knowledge and some information that.
Did you hear my neck pop?
What?
Did you hear me pop my neck?
Was that your neck?
Yeah.
I thought that was you. Let me see.
Well, I already did.
What, you pocket?
I was like that.
Yeah. Yeah, well, no. Thank you, and welcome back to the second segment of the show for today. We're talking to Alana3, and she's giving us some information in reference to the impact of imperialism and colonialism on the African continent. And so, Alana, let's take this second segment to become involved with what we mean when we say what kind of impacts are we talking about, and what were the consequences of all of this activity, and et cetera. Speak from that perspective.
To fully understand the effects of colonialism and imperialism in Africa, we must study what imperialism and colonialism is and what made it unique to what happened to Africa. So in the last segment, I talked about how imperialism and colonialism are not interchangeable, though most people believe that they are. In imperialism, the Webster definition for imperialism is when a larger country takes control of a smaller country because they're less powerful. And whatever the larger, the mother country does is up to the mother country. And we see that in effects in like early colonial United States, Jamestown, etc. But what happened to Africa is much different than what happened in North America, because the United States ended up becoming an empire. We see during this new imperialism period, the late 19th century to the early 20th, and the United States around this time, we were experiencing the Industrial Revolution. America was on a high. We were bringing in lots of money. There was new waves of immigration. Things were on the up and up for most Americans, but in Africa, things were totally different. The scramble for Africa is the term coined to describe how European countries were fighting and scrambling to carve out Africa and to make it into new colonies so that they could have power in Africa and so that Africa could feed their greed. Now, the scramble for Africa had 3 different categories that all made it come together. The first was economic. Now, like I mentioned, the Industrial Revolution was going on during this time period, and not just in America, but also in Europe. And because of this, European countries were constantly looking for countries where they could export raw materials, where they could have a profitable market and a good, safe, and secure place to build companies and to mine, etc. And so they immediately thought Africa and Asia, but Africa obviously got a more negative effect of imperialism. Now, after they figured out that Africa would be just such an economic boost, the political factors came into it. Now, some of the big European powers like Britain, France, Germany, Italy, etc., all of these countries were fighting for power. They all wanted to be the next big country, the next this, the next that. And one of the easiest ways to be able to do that is to conquer and colonize these African then tribes and ethnic groups. They weren't necessarily colonies or countries yet. Now, the last is social. Now, during the Industrial Revolution, things in Europe weren't always on the up and up like how I described they were in the United States. There was lots of social displacement from people in rural areas whose homes are now like mining towns or like factory towns. There was lots of unemployment and lots of homelessness. And so initially, even before these European powers discovered the political and all these other sides, all these other positives for colonizing Africa, the first thought that these European countries had was, oh, we're just going to send our surplus population to these settler colonies in Africa, and that'll help with the unemployment and the homelessness. And that was the initial thought. That was what was supposed to happen to Africa. But of course, we see in 2019 that that did not happen. Now, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, he kind of knew that since the scramble for Africa was so intense that there would be conflict. And so his way to combat this conflict was to have the Berlin Convention. Now, representatives from all the European countries who would eventually go on to colonize Africa were represented, but there were no representatives from the African continent. And that's going to prove detrimental very, very soon. But in this convention, in this conference, the Berlin Act was birthed, and that basically was a guideline of how to rule the Africans, how to tame them, what to do, how to work with the natives, etc., and etc. But of course, it was not very accurate because there was no one from Africa present at this. And the biggest thing that came out of the Berlin Convention was the fact that these European powers sat with a big map of Africa